to INSEAD. Welcome to INSEAD's Asia campus. It's one of the fireside chats that our students, our MBA clubs have arranged and invited. So I really have nothing to do with this. I'm just showing up to run basically the fireside chat. My name is Claudia Zeisberger. I'm a professor of private equity and venture capital. If there would be such a title, that would be the appropriate one. But I'm part of the entrepreneurship department here at INSEAD, and I look after anything private capital related, venture, growth equity, buyouts. I guess that's why I got the call to interview Hari. So we have Hari. Would you be so kind and interview him, please? So Hari Krishnan, by introduction, he's CEO of PropertyGuru. So aside from being a well-known entrepreneur, Hari joined PropertyGuru in, when did you take 2016. So 2016, at the time, PropertyGuru was a private company, then went public at the New York Stock Exchange in 2022. And last year, 2024, was taken private by EQT. EQT being a large, originally European from the Nordics private equity fund, that has a quite large footprint here in Asia now after doing an acquisition of another private equity firm here in Asia. So in that context, Hari is also an INSEAD alumnus. So obviously, thank you very much for coming back. Thank you very much for doing that. So, and it's going to be an interesting conversation. I'm interested in talking about the private to public to private side, but obviously what I will do, I will open the doors very quickly to questions from the audience. It's a reasonably intimate setting that we're having here. So please, if you have any questions, I will just start off with a few questions as a warm-up, but please, by show of hands, just raise your question and I will basically manage accordingly. Sounds good? So again, thank you very much. PropertyGuru, obviously, Hari, why don't you give us the pitch on PropertyGuru? So if you were listed, why would we buy your shares right now?
So PropertyGuru is, first off, good evening. Nice to meet all of you. I'm going straight into pitch mode. Now, PropertyGuru is Southeast Asia's largest PropTech business. We're proudly an INSEAD startup, started in 2007 by my classmate Yanni and his co-founder Steve. And we started in Singapore, expanded across Southeast Asia, and at its peak, we service about 40 million people every month. We're a business that has put millions of people into their homes. I would say with a lot of pride in Singapore, but also in certain cities in Vietnam and in Malaysia, we're a household name. I was sharing with someone recently, every once in a while I get to show off about the company. And I was meeting someone in America and they're like, what does your business do? And I sort of explained it and I said, well, it's sort of like, he said, well, it's like Zillow. I said, no, it's more like Google. Every Singaporean knows PropertyGuru. Not every American knows Zillow. So I say that with pride because I think that is the ethos with which we approach it. Our belief is we're trying to inject more transparency and efficiency into the property sector. And so though we started out as marketplaces and still remain in that space, over time we've done everything from property financing, home services, data products, and software for real estate developers and agents. So a bunch of different solutions. Yeah.
Okay. So,
and we were there before the iPhone. So when people say the app sucked, I'm like, well, we were there before the app, so I can't do much about that. So, bad answer. We approved.
So absolutely. So PropertyGuru, that's why it's especially a pleasure to have Hari here. PropertyGuru, really an INSEAD product, right? So Yanni is still very much part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Singapore after stepping out. So let's start off with that. As a CEO, so you've led PropertyGuru, as I said, from private to going public, and then again, back to being taken private. Quite decent growth, if I may say so, during that time. So tell us a little bit, what some good parts, but also what were some of your kind of this cost me sleepless nights situations?
No, I think when I joined about 10 years ago. And at that point, I think I'd known Yanni for years, obviously. I knew Steve socially over the years. And really nice guys. And I did my own homework. I was recruited. I was running LinkedIn at the time in the region. And actually, it's one of those things where as I entered the company, I had a sense of some of the opportunities, but also some of the challenges that faced me. But it was significantly harder than I expected, significantly harder. I'd say the first 2 years, just a sense of the guys had built a business at a point in time when the angel and VC ecosystem in Southeast Asia were non-existent. So the cap table was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. There were INSEAD professors, INSEAD alums, some of them in the room right now, a bunch of people, including me, who are sitting on the cap table as donors. You got this massive long tail of highly opinionated friends and family who were sitting there and who didn't hesitate to give me feedback. And then you had a couple of big investors. And it was, and we'll talk about that later, but I think that was my first introduction to something that looked so fragmented and what it would do in terms of some of the bolder moves I needed to make and making sure I was aligned with the investors. I think the other thing I understood was coming out of LinkedIn, I sort of looked at this and I said, this is not a tech company. This is not a tech company. Yanni and I had this very direct chat. I said, this is not tech. He and I both techies. I looked at him. This is not tech. This is the internet 0.0. It works. It's very, very good. I found all my homes on PropertyGuru. I'm very grateful for it, but it's a terrible experience. And there's no tech. There's no data. There's no nothing. And he agreed. And I think the journey that followed was making sure we complemented some of the existing gurus, our employees are called gurus, with new talent that understood technology, that were native techies, bringing in a focus on technology, bringing in our first data scientists, bringing in some of these aspects, and then bringing this discipline around fiscal discipline as well. Because there were, like, startups do 1,000 different ideas. And Steve and Yanni had a lot of strengths, but they'll be the first to tell you that the one thing they didn't do well is shutting things down. So for the whole first year, all I did was shut things down. That's all I did. It took me a good 12 months. I don't think I was fully done even, but I was just shutting stuff down. And it was truly random. There had no data to make these decisions. So I'd look at it, I'm like, yeah, it doesn't look exciting, shutting it down. And part of that was educating the team on how to manage me. So I remember at one point, the guys are like, how are you making these decisions? I said, do you have any data to tell me one way or the other? They're like, no, but I think. I said, oh, we're playing opinions. So let me explain this. And this is I'm paraphrasing someone I'd heard. I said, if we have data, let's look at it. If you're going with opinions, let's go with mine. And so I was educating them on, if you're going to play opinions, it's my opinion. That's all that matters. This is not a democracy. This is not how this company is going to be built from now on. There's going to be a neck to choke. It's mine. And we're going to go with this. And that built, for the techies, they were super quick at producing the data there. And now we're having intelligent conversations. And then I also obviously demonstrated where I would reverse direction and you changed my mind. Let's go that way. But I think there was a major cultural shift. And that when you go from VC to PE and that stage, from emerging to growth, there isn't enough conversation on how the culture needs to evolve. It doesn't organically happen. Sometimes it does if you're lucky, but it's the force of that leadership team, and it is entirely on them to be able to sort of sit there and say, no, this is the vision, these are the values.
So fair to say that you kind of like helped PropertyGuru kind of grow up, like get to the next stage, away from the startup stage towards, and this was 2016. Were you already thinking IPO at the time? Was this already kind of like one of the possible directions to go, or?
Definitely.
Yeah.
So I was part of the team at LinkedIn when we went public, and there was definitely a feeling that I had that if I have the chance to be the CEO, I think I can do this too. And that was the ego part of it. I was very transparent about it. I said, part of what's motivating me here is that outcome. I want to achieve that. Like, either IPO is one. I'm not saying we have to do an IPO, but I want to build a brilliant technology business that is hugely valuable. And I look at things like revenue and stuff as lagging indicators, but it is more, what's the value you're creating in your ecosystem where you're then able to capture your fair share, and that indicated by revenue, and therefore the valuation that you get. And in the end, I'd often tell the team, we're not in the business of maximizing revenue or EBITDA or profit. We're in the business of maximizing valuation. And there are different ways of doing this. And over the years, and particularly in the IPO thing, we achieved a much higher valuation than our board thought we could, because it's sales. And my job is to convince the investor that we're worth that much. And it's as simple as that. It's a sale. If they say it's worth that much, it's worth that much. It doesn't matter what your opinion is, because they paid for it. So I think that journey took us a while to get there. But I think lots of good and tough moments.
Okay. And let's stay basically with the kind of transition public-private for a little bit.
Yeah.
So how does, and you mentioned difficult cap table, messy cap table. For context, a cap table in a young company is the kind of Excel, for lack of a better word, where you keep track of all the investors that you have in your company, their share class, and their percentage shareholdings. Okay, so as you are obviously as a startup, as you're starting to raise money in the past 18 to 24 months, so you raise your next round, you are basically adding new investors to your cap table. So you will have heard round A, round B, round C, seed rounds, and so on. As you go forward, as you can imagine, that list gets longer and longer. The older investors don't necessarily disappear or sell out. So at one point, every startup, and I think it's a fair comment, will get to the point where you look at yourself and you're going, what have I done as an entrepreneur? And then it becomes time. Usually your round B investor will say, you got to clean up your cap table. Okay, so latest by round C, cleaning up the cap table means usually you go to your angel investors and you say, hey, how about you stepping out, right? We're buying your shares, secondary sale, so we're offering you X, right? And then depending what kind of angels you have, they probably politely say yes, okay? Or not, depending again what angels you have. So I'm a nice angel, so I never hold companies to ransom. Now, but even as a grown-up company, right, how does your capital strategy actually affect your business strategy? Because, of course, as you're raising money, you have choices, right? If you're a good company, you will have plenty of suitors when you're raising your round B and C and D. So you make choices. How do you think about it? Is capital strategy as important as business strategy?
It's more important. So I think there's something no one talks about. And that's why I actually came up with that term. And I was talking about it on our board. And the first time I said it, they're like, what the hell do you mean by capital strategy? And they were the people who had given us money. And I said, it's who you choose to raise money from and when. And that strategy at some point starts to actually dominate the business strategy, because eventually the shareholders start getting impatient, or they think they know more than you, or they own a significant chunk of you and they start telling you what to do. And I never owned more than 1% of the company. But I think maybe I'll blame INSEAD. I basically had this attitude like, no, it's my company. I'm not really listening to you. You can fire me. I recognize that. But as long as I'm in the job, I'm going to do it my way. And I think you need to do that as an entrepreneur. That would be my thing. It's easy to say. And there were moments when, God knows, even for me with my confidence, I would be like, okay, wow, this is going to be a hard conversation. But when I came in, as I mentioned, we had a very fragmented thing. And by about 2018, I sort of looked at it, and we were going into Vietnam at that point, and I knew we had to raise a significant amount of money. We were going to buy this company. We had already taken a small stake in 16, and then we were going to buy it out. And I went to the board and the founders, and I said, okay, we're going to have to clean it up. And actually, they didn't say it. I said it. It was a nightmare to manage shareholders. I said, I'm spending more time on you guys than on the business. This is wrong. This is not what you pay me to do. So this needs to stop. And so the way we're going to do this is a bunch of you are going to sell, and I'm going to raise from just one person. And we're gonna take a big check. So, and because we're going private equity, we weren't that large, and there was a real fiscal discipline on the board and with myself, and where we didn't want to raise too much. And so I think that was a really good lesson. And we didn't want to get too greedy with the valuation. Valuations were frothy by 2018. And we're like, okay, let's get a good valuation, but let's not go nuts. And that's again a part of that conversation, because some people are like, what are you talking about? This is my exit. I want to go nuts. I mean, go for the biggest one. But we're like, no, we need to leave a little bit on the table so that the next person makes money, right? And that's a conversation, it's a discussion. But essentially, we moved from a very fragmented table, brought in KKR. They borrowed a bunch of other people, some of them completely, some of them enough where they dropped off the board, which, thank you God, that made my life a lot easier. And I basically went to the board and I said, okay, a bunch of you are entitled to 2 seats each. I need you to voluntarily drop one. The TPG, KKR, the founders, each of you get 2. You decide who stays on the board. I need one gone, because I'm going to recruit independents now. Because now it's time for us to grow up. And that conversation is very hard. And with Steve and Yanni, they're very dear friends. And we'd meet every Friday for the first 3 years. Every Friday we had a lunch. We just went on and on and on. We talked about our kids, we talked about our health, and we talked about the business if time permitted. But somewhere in that, I sort of lobbed that in. I was like, all right, guys, and then they brought it up the next Friday. And the next Friday, I'm like, no, you have to drop one. One of you has to go. And it did allow us to grow up. We were able to recruit a phenomenal chairman and a couple of really strong independent directors onto the board, because no one wants to come into this thing. You're a mid-sized company, you got a massive board, doesn't work. But the benefit of this is The early investors make a return. That's one. That's really important to show that you can provide a good financial return. The later investors, their vintage now starts to align with management. Because I wanted to build over the next 5 years, not the next 12 months. But somebody's already been there for 5 years. So they're like, no, I'm done. Like, I need to go. So that conversation. And so over time, we kept doing that. And so even the IPO, as part of that, we brought in a major strategic. And so now we were TPG, KKR, and REA. So we had three of them on the board. And then we went on and built from the others. And so you're creating this optionality and exit off ramps, as I like to call them. And I'm like, you're not a child. You decide when your off ramp comes. But the business is going to operate independent of your reality. You divorce the business strategy from capital strategy when you keep churning that over time. And I think we became very good at it. And that's why we grew the business 8x over the 10 years and what a 25% CAGR over a decade. It's hard to achieve with COVID, but the reason is capital strategy. It actually wasn't the business strategy.
So having the right people
on
the board,
correct.
The right investors at
They'll
the right
push you in
time.
the right ways. They'll give you the right inputs. They'll give you access in ways. KKR brought different input from TPG. Early on, we had Square Peg, and the founder created Seek. So he understood marketplaces really well. So he was very good at working with me. I was running product myself at the time. So he and I would talk all the way down to product features. I didn't need that by the time KKR came. I needed someone to take us IPO. KKR's ECM team, the Equity Capital Markets team in New York, was phenomenal. The access they gave us, we were able to access investors. No way, they never heard of PropertyGuru. Some of them barely knew Singapore. They knew KKR. So they take the call. So that is the access you get. And that capital then gives you more space to do what you really want to do, which is the business.
So fair to say that every startup should have kind of a board plan or an investor
100%,
plan?
100%. I think I had dinner yesterday actually with an entrepreneur here in Singapore, a CEO. I meet him from time to time. And he was asking about exactly this. And his board has shrunk over time to about 2 people. He's trying to recruit me. One, I said, I'm too tired, I'm not doing it. But the second thing I did tell him is you do need to have a certain size. You don't want it too large, but there is such a thing as too small. And everyone focuses on control, and you can manage that through shareholding. But there's the other aspect that the board plays, which is advice. And until last year, when we sold, the chair of our ARC, she was an independent director, ex-CFO. The level of input and scrutiny she had, the level of detail she looked at into our financials, even our CFO, who's very, very good, would sometimes miss something. Jenny, who was our chair of ARC, never missed anything. So it's like an extension of your management team, part of your team whose only job is to look at your final product and say, yeah, not good enough, and kick it up a notch. And I think that is something which people lose. They think, okay, all the smarts are here. Like, no. There's a lot. You can bring other people onto the team.
Right. So let's look at markets, right? So some of you from the students, for sure, are for the first time in Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia real estate market, very fragmented, right? You talked 2018, you said you entered Vietnam, right? So very different from Singapore, I assume different from Indonesia, different from all the other markets here. So how did you manage to do that? So, I mean, you're still a property guru in all those markets. So how did you scale?
For better or worse, maybe it's luck, maybe I just figured it out. But by the end of 2016, I coined a phrase which I said, we're going to be standardized on the back end and localized on the front end. I meant it for the tech, but I also meant it for the team. So what I mean by that is, I'll talk about the team first. You need to create centers of excellence where you can get world-class talent. Doesn't matter where they're from. Our head of engineering is from Brazil, right? I don't care where that person is from. You come here and we will build a world-class environment. We'll create a center of excellence, enough critical mass of engineering talent, finance talent, people talent, whatever it is, where you can work with some of the best and improve your work product, become a better professional working for us. The front end, sales and marketing, you need 100% local. So in Vietnam, it's Vietnamese, then nobody but Vietnamese people in the front end, nobody but Singaporeans in our front end sales team, marketing team over here. Malaysians, Indonesians earlier, I got to talk about that in a second, and Thais. And that understanding also applies to tech. So for example, I use this as a simple example, but Google Maps is our infrastructure. That's the same back end. But the front end adaptation of that, in Singapore, we think in terms of districts. In Bangkok, we think in terms of proximity to the BTS station. So how you actually localize it needs to be whatever. But the back end, we're not using different map tech and all that. We got the same thing. So you have a certain critical mass, you have better buying power, you have better economies of scale, basically. And that allows you to build a portfolio business. And PropertyGuru fundamentally is a portfolio business. For the first 4 or 5 years, the Singapore property market was cooled by the government and actually wasn't doing that well. And people have forgotten that because 21 and 22 was so strong, but it wasn't doing well. And I remember when we were trying our first IPO in 2019, people said, what happens if you get a bad patch? And I said, I've never seen a good patch. So my entire time had been cooling measures, and we'd grown despite that. But we had two rocket ships, Vietnam and Malaysia. Post-COVID, Singapore exploded, and Vietnam did well for a while, then it went through some other stuff, Malaysia. So the thing is, these are countries with different political systems, different economic stages, high degree of complexity, huge. But what I have experienced over the last decade is essentially a fundamental hedge built into the fact that we have these disparate businesses. And that's why you're able to do 25% CAGR, because there were years when Vietnam was doing 50, 60% growth, but Singapore was down into the single digits. Then the last few years, Singapore has been well over 20 off a very strong base. But the benefit is that when I came in, 90 to 95% of the revenue came from Singapore. Today, 55% comes from Singapore. So we are de-risked. And yes, it's still 55%, but most people think we're only Singapore. It's only that marketplace that people are familiar with. I'm like, yeah, that's a portion of our revenue. It's the biggest portion, but it isn't the fastest growing. And it isn't what I as CEO was thinking about at all. Because that's almost like on autopilot. And I'm very focused on the places where we're still battling. Vietnam or Malaysia, Thailand for sure. I recently stepped off as CEO, by the way. But before that, it was much more on the software products and some of the other things which I was interested in. And that's where, by the way, when I said you get to do the stuff you want, I brought my experience from online travel, my experience from LinkedIn. And I said, there are these experiences where you can drive workplace automation. They will pay for it if you build it good enough. And some of those decisions were right, some of them were wrong. The software product I pushed out in 2023, we shut it down. And we also pulled out of Indonesia. While we were a listed business, everyone like, you can't pull out of the biggest economy. I'm like, actually, no. Because I've been talking to our shareholders throughout and said, we focus on unit economics. And we have displayed the unit economics. And now after spending a decade in Indonesia, the unit economics aren't there. So we will pull out. We have to show courage of our conviction. And actually, by doing that, the shareholders rewarded us. The board actually celebrated us. We had a board director who was born in Indonesia. So I thought there'd be a little bit of a personal thing. And he was at KKR, so I was like, he's going to get a little upset. And he's like, finally. When I made the recommendation, he said, okay, finally. So it's sometimes, you make up these things of, oh, it's going to be so hard. How do I sell this? I was ready with the sales pitch. I didn't need more than the first line, which was, we're shutting Indonesia. Okay, next. What's the next question? No questions.
So I have one more question, and I'm going to open to questions from the audience. Property in general and real estate. I mean, real estate has had its challenges globally, it's fair to say, not just because of COVID. It's being challenged for all kinds of reasons, materials, and so on. So Proptech, right, is obviously a big talking point. We have a couple of funds here in Singapore that invest only in Proptech, right? Your thoughts on that? So is it, are we going to, what will the city of the future kind of look like?
Oh, that's what I've been talking the last 2 years.
Is it going to be, is it really going to change fundamentally? It's a very old-fashioned industry, right? It's
very, very. Now, there's one of the cities of the future, but I think the core, if I just look at that term Proptech, for the first 3 years, I often joke about the fact that you've brought together two worlds that make no sense at all together.
Yeah.
The property industry is slow, it's opaque. And this one is fast and it's dynamic and it's all these things, and you put it together and it's a bloody mess, right? I mean, where the rubber meets the road. The generous or the polite view would be to say, listen, it's the largest asset class in the world. It's worth more than all the other asset classes combined, multiplied by something. So the risk of getting it wrong is immense, even terminal. And therefore, I understand a slowness in adoption. That's the generous answer. The more honest answer I'll say in this room is a lot of business models in property have been built through information asymmetry. They need information asymmetry. They need to know more than you, and that's how they make money. And technology is about transparency and efficiency. Now, what I would say is they have invested on the efficiency side. If you look at, forget about sales and marketing, if you look at property management, robots are used in security, they're used in cleaning. You have, when you look at construction, AR helmets have been used in construction long before, I mean, consumers still don't use AR. AR is used in construction every day in Singapore and in other parts of the world. Yeah. So it's not true that technology is in use, but digital, internet, technology, which drives transparency, in process and systems, CRM products, etc., actually don't work. They complain, but they don't work. Developers used to complain, I don't know which product the agent is selling. We gave them a CRM. They didn't seem to want it. There was almost this thing. And real estate, in the end, is a relationship business. It is globally. As I've met my peers in the US and Europe, it always has been. And it is still very much about humans dealing with humans. And technology can make you a little more efficient. But a little bit of that transparency lacking, I'm not surprised. It just is antithetical to the economics of the model. You need information asymmetry for some of these guys to succeed. That's just the truth.
Okay.